Welcome to Crying Out Loud. I'm Dr. Laura Berman, and this is your grief companion. Join me to learn how to soften the pain, steady the nervous system, and connect to your loved ones on the other side. None of us were meant to grieve alone, so let's cry out loud together.
So I'm crying out loud, I'm not holding it in, I'm shrinking my heart.
One of the hardest parts of grief isn't just losing someone you love, it's discovering that the world doesn't really know what to do with your grief. People expect us to move on or to let go or even to stop talking about the person we love or to cry less to get back to normal. Those expectations are all wrong, and today's guest agrees with me. Her name is Carla Fernandez, and she is the author of Renegade Grief. After losing her father at just 21 years old, she began to question so many of the messages our culture gives us about grief. And in her book, she invites us to challenge those expectations and create a relationship with grief that is authentic, deeply personal, and uniquely our own. In this conversation, Carla and I are exploring why grief was never meant to be carried alone and why we don't have to let go of the people we love in order to heal. Also, why grieving well sometimes means become, as she puts it, a little bit of an outlaw. We also talk about something that really resonated with me, the difference between turning pain into purpose versus using purpose to avoid your pain. It's such an important distinction, especially for those of us who have found meaning in helping others after loss. So, whether your loss is recent or happened years ago, I hope this conversation gives you permission to grieve in a way that feels true to you, to create rituals that bring you comfort, and to remember that love does not end when life does. Here's my conversation with Carla Fernandez.
Carla Fernandez, thank you so much for joining us on The Language of Love.
Happy to be here, Laura.
I'm so glad you're with us. I have so much I want to dive into with you. Obviously, this is a topic near and dear to my heart, which I'm sure will be coming up. But let's just start with the title of the book, which I think can become its own term. As we were talking before we started recording, the name of the book is Renegade Grief. So, what is Renegade Grief?
I thought you might ask. To me, renegade grief is a sensibility that recognizes that if we live in the Western world in America, as you and I both do, that we live in a world that is grief avoidant and death denying. And you and I are not the first people to talk about this. But what it means is that in order to actually grieve well, whatever that means for you, you have to be a little bit of an outlaw, a little bit of a renegade. You kind of have to swim against the cultural currents that would have you be back to work in 3 days and probably not talking about the person that died all that often and sort of pretending like everything had gotten back to some kind of normal, which you and I both know there is no more normal when someone significant in your life dies. So to me, renegade grief is sort of a narrative shift or a change in perspective around thinking about grief as something that has to be completed, that is often talked about in sort of these sad pastel colors, that is purely sad. But in reality, and the experience I've had as someone who's experienced a significant loss and as a community organizer who has sat for hundreds of hours of conversations with other people who are grieving, grief is so many different colors. It is technicolor. There's so much more to it than the kind of cultural overculture would make you think. So renegade grief is really my attempt to introduce a different way of talking about it into the cultural narrative.
Yeah, which is so needed. And we're going to get into like how we got here in a minute and why I found that part of the conversation, all of it really fascinating in your book, but we'll get into that in a second. But I just want to start because not only, as you mentioned, you went through your own loss with your father when your father died, and that was kind of a key catalyst to where we are today or where you are today. But also as part of that, and maybe you can help flesh out the timeline, but you started something called the dinner parties. So, and that became you speak to that a lot in the book, and a lot of what you learned not only came from your own journey, but all the beautiful stories you share from your dinner partiers who attended those dinner parties. So how did it start, and what are or were the dinner parties?
Great. So I was 21 when my dad died of cancer, and I did all the things that a type A person might do. I had and have an incredible therapist. And yet I found that setting to be more of a monologue. I wanted to be with people my own age who'd experienced a loss. I went to more traditional grief support groups, and I found that a lot of the people in the parent loss groups were decades older than I was, having lost a parent at maybe a more natural time in life. And the place where I missed my dad the most, he was very involved in food and wine, and his grandparents had owned a restaurant. And the place where my grief hit the hardest was around the dinner table. So, in sort of an active, creative, artistic exploration, I was like, what if I could sit back down at the dinner table where my dad is no longer, but invite other people who get what I'm going through, who've experienced a loss themselves, to break bread and make the loss experience that we're going through kind of the main course of the meal, and actually talk about the thing that we were all getting really good at avoiding.
Yeah.
So I hosted a dinner. Thought it was going to be a one-off on my back deck in Los Angeles Echo Park, where I lived at the time, and I invited a handful of other people who I knew through different social circles, and somebody from work and someone that I knew from high school, to come and talk about the thing that we'd all gotten really good at avoiding. And it was incredible. It was magical. It was the beginning of something that felt so simple, not rocket science. It was literally just a potluck dinner, but we were allowing ourselves to open up about a part of our story that really didn't have many other outlets. And my friend came that night. Her name's Lennon Flowers, and she became my co-founder of the dinner party and was our executive director for the last 10 plus years. And that dinner over time evolved into a monthly gathering for that first table. And as people started to hear about it, we started to get inbound requests to join the table or to start their own table. And since then, the organization has now served about 20,000 young adult grievers across the US, and we're still going.
That's amazing. I think, and what I also love about it is not only sort of you answering that call and it turning into something so beautiful, but also with regard to the renegade piece, dinner parties are something that most grievers avoid, because you're not supposed to, like when you go to a dinner party or a cocktail party or an event or something that's supposed to be festive or social, you are expected to leave your grief at the door. And so often I notice that my fellow grievers don't avoid. That's one of the reasons we isolate ourselves, is because we don't want to leave it at the door, and we can't leave it at the door. Not to mention, fucking small talk is impossible anymore. So, like, I'm supposed to be talking about the weather or, I don't know, your latest job search or whatever, which is fine. But like, there's an 800-pound gorilla standing next to me that I can't talk about. So I think it's such a beautiful, on that level too, that in a setting where you're technically not supposed to be talking about these topics, in most of polite society, not at my dinner table, that's for damn sure, but in most of polite society, that was opened up, I think, is a really beautiful oxymoron, but is perfect.
I so appreciate that. And it felt radical at the time. It felt like the what do you not talk about around the dinner table? Death, sex, and money. And here we were talking about death. And oftentimes, I'm sure those conversations lead into conversations about sex and money too. They're all sitting in the same bed, basically. So it kind of had this like rebellious spirit, even though we weren't breaking any rules. But the more time I've spent sort of studying the topic, and I write about this in one of the chapters in the book, is that actually humans have turned to one another and turned to food since time immemorial to process and connect and nourish after a loss experience. And there's so much incredible ritual around food and dining and feasting related to honoring the dead that at the time it felt novel. And yet I know that there's like no new idea under the sun. And this thing that we were being drawn to do was actually a ritual that our ancestors had done and our ancestors before them, which I always love to look at those kind of breadcrumbs to understand this is a human instinct. And we just didn't have the table to sit down at the time. So we created our own.
Yeah, perfect. And it's a perfect segue to what I want to talk about next, which is there was a time, obviously, in human history, there was a very long time where we knew how to grieve, where it was just part of the cycle of life, and where mourning and what I call crying out loud, which is sort of my mantra for people, to take grief out of the shadows where it gets stuck, where we're taught and encouraged to stick it and therefore do so. But, for most of our human history, it has been a natural, encouraged, collective, supported, welcome experience. And you write about it in the book, and I found this part really fascinating because I'd never really thought about it before, how up until colonialism, basically, the turn of the 20th century, this was the case. And you even spoke about how Queen Victoria popularized the wearing of black as a fashion statement and all of that. And then something happened in our human history, and I'm going to let you explain it because you can do it much better than I, that kind of changed the paradigm in a really fascinating way. And that led us to where we are today with our grief repression.
Mm. It was such an important part of the research that I did for this book to ask myself, how did we get here? Where did we lose the plot? And I think that you can point to a lot of the big social issues we're facing today and point a fat finger at capitalism and the patriarchy. And this is all part of that same story. And it was interesting for me to read some of the research of scholars that have linked this sort of change in our relationship to grief from one where there was more protocol around it, more ritual around it, into something that became more individually held. People were expected to deal with it on their own and not communally. One of the things I point to is the rise of the world wars in the 20th century and the sort of human loss at a scale that was sort of unfathomable to the human psyche, and the ways in which that during that time it was seen almost unpatriotic to grieve the dead because they had fallen for these big rights and these big freedoms and these military pursuits. So there was sort of a new taboo around expressing grief around that time. Freud, who was just a man, he wrote in his seminal text, Mourning and Melancholia, that actually showing signs of ongoing grief basically was implied that you were unwell and that you were too attached to dying, and that the thing that we needed to do as a psychiatrist working with the patient was to encourage people to what he called sever ties or break bonds. And my favorite part of the Freud story is that there are letters that he wrote to a friend of his in the years following his own daughter dying. And she died of
After his treatise on how you should work, sever ties and get on and get calm and carry on.
He kind of mainstreamed the best practices: break bonds, cut ties, pull it together. If you're still missing them, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
And then he actually experienced a significant loss, and his daughter died Spanish influenza, the biggest pandemic that the world had known until COVID. And he writes in letters to a friend very vulnerably that he was wrong. And that actually the only way that he can imagine moving forward with the absence of his daughter in her physical form is to hold her memory dear. And it's so interesting to me that it shows how the ideas can take hold and not let go, even when the originator of the idea is like, oh, maybe there's a different way we could have done this. And since then, in the last 30 years, there's been incredible research that's been released that proves we're not here to sever the bonds with those who have died. Actually, the work is about continuing bonds. And actually, the work is about the dual process model of grief, where we kind of titrate in and out. And yet we could release scientific research all day long, but if it's not impacting the zeitgeist of how people, the muscle memory that they have around it and the zeitgeist of how we tend to it, then it can't go all that far. So I'm happy to be able to write about some of that research in my book and kind of add to the chorus of voices that are saying that it's not about severing the tie. It's about figuring out how you hold this person's memory in your life, and also finding the kinds of friendships and connections and companionship with people who can normalize your grief and who can be with you in it, in the ups and the downs.
Yeah. And that is how we're designed. There's nothing wrong with you. I can't tell you how often, and I talk now to thousands of people in person and online, and their comments on what I'm posting and my video, whatever. And there's this sense again and again that there's something wrong with me, that I can't get over it. And also a lack of permission. And we'll get into this in a minute. You mentioned it, this idea, this core element, which to me is such a huge part of healing, that recognizing that the relationship does not end when a loved one dies. And there are many ways we'll get into, many you cover in your book, about how to keep that relationship going and what an important piece of the journey that is. But it reminds me what you're talking about with Freud. I mean, not that I'm drawing a comparison. He would probably hate to be compared to Freud, but I was thinking about my friend David Kessler, who is a really beautiful grief educator and advocate, one of the best known ones. He wrote a beautiful book about it years ago. But I've spoken to him and had him speak at some events. And he has said, I've heard him say many times that he got into grief work when his mother died. And he had done years and years of grief work when he lost his son. And after he lost his son, he said that he wanted to call up every person he had ever counseled in grief and apologize because he didn't understand, even in that case, that not that he was doing what Freud did and telling them to get over it and something was wrong with them if they couldn't. In fact, he normalized the opposite, but just even a deeper loss for him, which many, and you write about this too, that child loss. I mean, not that there's a hierarchy to loss, but that seems to be one of the worst ones. There's something about that, many things about that. We don't have to get into it because this isn't about child loss, but that highlighted for him the ways in which maybe he was not sensitive enough to the pain that people were in around their losses. And I think that's probably what happened to Freud. He was used to people dying of illness or old age, when that it was just about your unresolved relationship with your father or your mother or your uncle or your sister. And he had never experienced the loss of all losses. And once he did, he was like, oh, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't universalize this.
I love David's ability to kind of evolve and grow, and he's such an incredible contributor to the field. And yeah, it's interesting because more and more as the dinner party community has grown, we have leaned into what we refer to as affinity tables for exactly this thing we're talking about, which is unless you've gone through the thing that someone else has gone through, you don't fully ever grok it.
Yeah.
And we're finding that more and more people are interested in it, joining tables that are not purely for grief generally, but are related to an identity that they hold, whether they are LGBTQ or whether they're a person of color, or what the loss type was or the cause of death was. And to me, that it really speaks to the power of peer support and finding people with whom who can say, we've all learned the power of the phrase "me too." So much of this work is about finding your grief companion who can say "me too" to what you've been through, so that you can then normalize what it is you're feeling and stop wondering and worrying if you're doing it wrong, but actually have someone who can look across the table at you and tell you that it might not be the same for them, but can normalize whatever it is you're feeling.
Yeah, I remember the first time I just kind of spontaneously, maybe much like you did the first dinner party. I just kind of spontaneously, and it was like a year after my son died, and I was finally kind of coming back to life. And I was very much aware at this point of how, really almost immediately, at how grief illiterate everybody was. And I wasn't, because I had lost both my parents and my grandmothers and my spirit mother. And I was a therapist who understood grief and had counseled people through grief, even though that wasn't the focus of my work. But experiencing this depth and breadth of loss, especially with Sammy, I was looking around and being like, no, has any freaking idea how to do this? And then hearing from thousands upon thousands of parents when the news about Sammy accidentally went viral, I was hearing, just seeing and meeting all of these parents and all of these mothers in particular in just profound, impossible, isolated pain. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do a meetup. I don't know what the hell's going to happen, but I'm just going to announce that I'm doing this meetup on the beach at Tower 25 in Santa Monica at 2 p.m. on Sunday in October, and whoever wants to come. And I put it on social media, and I wasn't even sure anyone would come. David Kessler and his partner, Paul Deniston, who does grief yoga, came with me. And I was thinking, oh, and my friend Tina, who's like my emotional support angel and does all the groups with me. I was thinking, okay, so if it's just the four of us, we'll do some grief yoga. We'll hang out on the beach. It'll be great. I see these 10 women kind of walking toward me from all these different directions. And all of a sudden, I totally shocked myself because I started sobbing. And I realized, like, holy shit, you're such an idiot, Laura. Like, I was thinking, here I am thinking that I'm going to be of service. And I was intending to be of service, but I need this for me.
Yeah.
I need this for me too. And I wasn't even doing it for me. But it's been such a huge, because I'm not usually a group person. I lead the group, but I'm not usually a group participant, right? But I realized that with grief in particular, having that support from people who intimately understand your pain. And yeah, it's great if it can really specifically understand your pain. That's even better. But we can't always have that. Just being around other people who understand profound loss is unbelievably healing. Just that. Not having just with whom words aren't really necessary to explain it and with whom you don't have to make excuses. And I always have a rule. It's so fascinating because they notice now, the mamas, because we have these monthly meetups now. They now kind of edit themselves and catch themselves, but it's amazing. And this is kind of speaking to what we were talking about before with the way the culture has conditioned us, how often, almost always, we apologize when we start freaking crying. Like that, when you think about that, and nobody thinks about it, I didn't either before all of this, but like, how effed up is that we actually apologize for feeling our, oh, I'm sorry, because I might be making you uncomfortable and it's inappropriate to cry, even though like I've experienced this horrible loss. So like I've outlawed, you're not allowed to say I'm sorry. It's kind of a joke. I mean, they don't get in trouble if they say they're sorry, but it's interesting to see how automatic that reflex is.
It's a really good ground rule. I like that.
Yeah, no apologizing for crying. Okay, so you spoke about grief companions, and I know you, and we're kind of jumping ahead toward the end of the book. You talk about becoming a grief ally and supporting others. I do think those are kind of two sides of the same coin. This idea of like finding a community and recognizing the importance of that in whatever form that's going to come. But also, not right away, because I think lots of us rush to that. And I want to talk about that too. This idea of caring through action, turning pain into purpose, and also as maybe part of that, becoming an ally to others. And I've watched this with the mamas. Some of them have been with me for 2 years, meeting monthly. And now as new members come in, I see them reaching out as kind of a leader and a helper and an ally in a really beautiful, organic way. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, as well as like when because I've noticed that a lot of people, almost as an unconscious desire to bypass the pain, which is natural. They're like, I'm going to start a foundation. I'm going to help. And meanwhile, their loved one died 2 weeks ago. And like, they're just, you know what I mean? So sometimes we can avoid our pain by helping others, which doesn't serve anyone. But I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah. So much to say.
I know. I just threw a lot of questions in one to you.
On the question of the grief allyship and the kind of the culture change, I feel like I'm a part of so many conversations where we're like, can you believe that they said that thing? Or can you believe that my employer doesn't give any bereavement leave days? Or there's like the complaint department can go off when talking about grief and loss and everything around it, understandably so.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of been this moment of like looking in the mirror and wondering what is it going to require to actually change these cultural patterns and these norms. And it's probably going to be the people who've lived it to the best of their ability, offering an alternate way of responding to the question, or talking to the HR department about the possibility of extending bereavement leave or whatever that might be. So, and this is not something that I would ever suggest as like on the top 10 list of things to do for someone who is recently grieving. And it's interesting to me to now look at the world that I move through the lens of how do I clean up the spill on aisle 8 a little bit more so that when my next batch of friends are going through a grief experience, it's like a little bit less of a mess, or there's a little bit more grief sensitivity in the world. And that can be big legislative changes. Like I am such a huge fan of the work that you're doing around Sammy's Law, having researched it. It's incredible. And like you are a walking embodiment of that, of how do we put protections in place that reduce the amount of grief that families are feeling because of online harassment. I don't know if that's the right phrase to use, online harassment. Harm.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I think it's cool to look around and see the different ways that grief allyship kind of takes form, whether it's someone advocating for bereavement leave or someone like yourself trying to change a law and protect potential future grievers. Yeah, and it's been interesting over the years. In many ways, I started the thing that I personally needed. And I've had to take time stepping away from the organization over the last 15 years because my grief was I had to tend to my grief privately once the work that I'd created in partnership with Lennon Flowers became very public,
Yeah.
and teasing apart the part of myself that was a nonprofit co-founder fundraising, using my personal story to try to raise funds to keep this thing going. And then the person who was a young adult who is still grieving her father. And there's a lot of, in my journey, there's been a lot of sort of teasing apart the different hats that I play and the roles that I play in the, after many years of working within an organization and creating a community that was all about sitting in circle, sharing stories, the times where I've also needed to have more independent processing or not sit in the circle and share stories. So I think it's like,
And it's hard to sit in the circle as the facilitator. I mean, I experienced this too, as because I'm sort of a participant and a facilitator at the same time. And when you get it so far into the purpose, and like you said, the fundraising and the orchestration and the organization, even if you're still telling your story a lot and it's connected to your story as the core of what you're doing, there is a way in which you can disassociate from the story in order to do those other things and lose touch with your, I find, speaking for myself, with my own grief work or my own grief process. And then it'll just come and gobsmack you. I remember when we did our first Grieving Mama retreat last year, I thought, I mean, I knew it was going to be a lot because it was my first time going to this place that had been so key to my beginning of my healing journey. And it was so meaningful to me. And I hadn't been back there since. And I knew a lot was going to come up. And knew I was going to have like a lot of emotion just that this dream was coming to fruition and it was happening and all that I was holding space for. But I had to keep sneaking off into the redwoods to just bawl because it was the weirdest experience, one of the weirdest experiences of my life to be holding, and you speak to this too, I speak to this a lot, holding such extreme joy and elation over what I had been able to help create and what was happening, and such tremendous pain about my own loss and all that was coming up around that, all at the same time, like two huge extremes. I was like, I don't even know what to do with all of this. But yeah, I think it can be difficult. And I meet a lot of mamas, for instance, who are like, well, my son just died 2 weeks ago by suicide. And already spoken to a lawyer. I'm starting a foundation to raise awareness. I'm like, that is wonderful. And no rush. Like, because I think that's a way that we unconsciously can bypass it. I almost want to bypass, not intentional, but like, let me just do something about it. And it can not that it's not going to come up later. Let's see, if it doesn't come up now, it's going to come up later, but it can kind of rob you of the healing accidentally, I find.
it's so interesting. Like I outlined this book in 2012 and it took me a long time to actually write it. And there's been times where I have like self-flagellated about that, the delta between 2012 and the year it comes out, 2025. And yet, I think much to what you're talking about, I don't think I was ready to write it then. And I wasn't ready to write it 5 years later. And it was really in around 2020 where I was like, okay, it's time. And I don't ever want to counsel someone to just sit on their hands and do.
If they're feeling called to do something. Yeah.
It's like how do it's answering the call, but I don't know. There's not one way to do it. And I feel like the work is really about building the internal tools and the relationships that you can kind of check in with yourself around whether this is like honoring the grief and this is like where you're being called and responding to the call and when we're bypassing and how to kind of check in on that on a day-to-day basis, probably.
Yeah. Keeping a balance. I think it's really about keeping the balance and noticing, am I letting myself feel? I know you speak a lot to this in many of the different chapters of your book around releasing your anger and letting out the sadness and the importance of that and the rituals around that you speak to in lots of the stories you tell, I thought were really beautiful too.
Yeah, that became when we started to host these dinners and started to share stories. The theme that blew me away were stories of people who came to the table and were like, I don't know what to do, but I'm finding that naturally I'm drawn towards X. I am writing a letter to my dad every year on his death anniversary, and I'm putting it in a bottle and I'm throwing it in the ocean because that's the place where I felt most connected to him. Or I'm building a Day of the Dead ofrenda, and like my family didn't do it, but I think my grandmothers did. Or there's just I was blown away by the stories that were all about at their core like creativity and resilience and experimentation and agency and working with this as a sort of a material versus what I had kind of heard culturally that grief is something that you like memorial, funeral, back to work, good luck.
Yeah.
And that was
Good luck.
so over the last decade, I've been sort of just listening for and collecting these stories of care practices. Some of them are individual, but many of them are done collectively and give people a reason to come together. And whether you're honoring your past or finding ways to be present with your grief, or whether you're creating your future and thinking about how your loss experience might weave its way into the decisions you make about your future. I've just been so moved by, and that's the sort of the spirit that I'm calling the renegade grievers, are people who are, despite never being handed the manual of how to grieve, are finding their own way through and are using it as an opportunity to experiment and to live a more soulful life and to build relationships with people that are going below the surface of sort of everyday conversation. And at the end of the day, to me, it's less and less about handling the grief or tending to the grief and more about how do we remove the social isolation that
Yeah.
gets wrapped around it. Like, we're not here to solve or fix or save ourselves from the grief. I think it's this essential human process that we go through that helps us make sense of impermanence and mortality. But what I'm so interested in is how all of these people that I've met over the years, who I write about in the book, have found their own way to remove the isolation, to face their loss experience, and to just figure out what messages it has for them.
Yeah, and the rituals they have created. I mean, we talk about this a lot in our WhatsApp group. Whenever there's an anniversary or a birthday, or certainly around the holidays, the mamas will be weighing in and being like, "Yeah, it's my son." It's always like that anticipatory grief of birthday is coming or the angelversary is coming or whatever, and I don't know any ideas for how I might honor him. And then there's this
Mhm.
like slew of beautiful examples of what people are doing to honor their loved ones or just to honor their loss, or the way that they're memorializing year to year, or just the little simple traditions. Like, I have a small little simple thing that I didn't even tell anyone in my family. And that's another conversation about why there wasn't really, it's not like it's taboo in my family, but we all grieve in such different ways that I have just conditioned myself to. I mean, I certainly don't repress it when I'm upset or really going through it, but my little traditions, and unless I want their involvement, I don't necessarily even alert the world to it. And I've had one since Sammy died, of getting him an ornament, which I don't do for, and never did for my other kids. We certainly got them ornaments, and they picked out ornaments and made ornaments that we still have and put on the tree every year. But since Sammy died, since he can't, and he was so into decorating everything, since he can't decorate the tree, for some reason, I got him an ornament every year. And I would just have this little ceremony with myself when no one else was around, of putting his ornament on the tree. And it didn't even come up. I think this is the fourth Christmas without him, or the third Christmas without him. And it didn't come up until this year, that when a girlfriend was over, and my friend Tina, I was talking about, she goes, "Oh, what are these angel wings? What is this?" And I was like, "Oh, that's the ornament that I got for Sammy this year. And here's the one from last year. And here's the one from," and my kids were like, "Oh," they hadn't even really noticed. So it doesn't have to be out loud. Like, you can do these, but there were beautiful examples in the book of so many wonderful ways that people have navigated those big days or created rituals. And I want to speak to you about this idea of the grief quest, because I think that's a really beautiful way, not only to honor your loss, but to honor your loved one in a really beautiful, personalized way. But there's so many beautiful stories in there. So speak to us about the grief quest piece, because I loved that.
First of all, I love your ornament ritual. It's so sweet. And yeah, I have follow-up questions for you about that, but we'll save it. The grief quest, I noticed a pattern. I feel like a lot of writing this book was just sort of pattern matching around the stories that I heard from people who came to the dinner party table over the years and conversations with friends. And I found that there was a theme around traveling, visiting a destination that felt connected to the person who is no longer physically present, traveling in a way that was sort of changing the scenery related to grief, traveling in a way that was like sort of fulfilling some unfinished business of the person who's no longer here physically or of the person who is grieving. And I dubbed it in kind of a corny way grief quest. In the sense
I
that,
like that. I like that. I'm into corny terms, I guess. I like the idea of a grief quest.
because it's not just like a trip. Usually people have like an intention of something that they're trying to release or tend to. And it's like it's the journey, not the destination of it all. And it was interesting to kind of have that framing and to interview different people from our community and to hear how that manifested for them, and to also realize that like a grief quest can be done in an 8-hour Sunday in your own hometown. You don't just have to go back to the ancestral lands or whatever the places where you might be called. There's ways to create that ritual of going on a grief quest, even just like if you're in LA as you are, Laura, going to the beach or finding a place of nature. Or it's really about setting aside the time to tend to the memory and use that as a framework to see what might come up. Have you gone on any grief quests?
Yeah, I mean, I have definitely. I've done that with my parents. Mostly when I go, interesting, my grief quest with my parents has been to go back home to my home, which I don't go to. I have a lot of really traumatic memories there, not necessarily because of my family, although they certainly gave me their share of trauma, but just because the place itself, while unbelievably gorgeous and beautiful, and there were so many gifts to living there environmentally, socially was extremely othering and traumatizing. And I was really badly bullied. So I would never go back there again, if not for the fact that it's gorgeous and beautiful and it's where my parents are and from. So I've gone back there many times to be with them, not just to go see them at the cemetery, but to like be in those places of my childhood and the places where I felt held by them. I haven't really gone on I guess my quest with Sammy was the grief retreat that I went back to the beginning, where had this whole crazy, it's a story for another time, but a whole crazy metaphysical experience that led me on a quest, literally, where I was sent to the redwoods to go all the way into my pain. This was just like a week after he left. And it was a command from spirit, for lack of a better way to explain it, and I was not one for taking commands or even hearing commands, but I did. And it really set me on the path. It was such a miracle how the whole thing unfolded, and it set me on this path to healing. And then I came back full circle when I brought a group of grieving mamas back there to go through the same thing that I did. That was a big, which is what I was just talking about when I felt all those emotions. That was a really big quest for me. But I don't think it has to be, like you said, that huge. I also have like a tree on this hike into Mescal Canyon, I'm big into trees, which is my Sammy tree. There's the mother tree in the Redwood Forest at 1440 Multiversity, where I do these mama retreats. She held me, the mother tree on the property there held me for hours crying. And so I go back to see her often. There are things like that. And you speak also in the book, which I think is so beautiful, about this idea of finding your quote unquote altar, which doesn't have to be like a religious altar, obviously, but it's this idea of giving your loved one physical coordinates, which I think is what the tree, Sammy's tree and things like that are for me. Or even the studio where I am, I have this corner, because when Sammy first died, my husband, he's better about it now, but like his way of dealing, like he couldn't deal. I was like just flooded and wanted it and wallowing in it, whatever. He wanted to compartmentalize. And so if there were pictures around, he asked me to put the pictures of Sammy away for a while. Because seeing them, if he wasn't actively in pain, it would throw him back into pain. So I put them all in my studio in this corner. I made a little cozy spot and I put all my pictures of Sammy there, where they still are. I have more in the house now, but that became almost an altar. And I know a lot of grievers do that for their loved ones. They even have them in their home, all the picture and the flowers and they light candles for them. But there's more. It doesn't have to be that. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. I think altars and shrines are one of these things similar to feasting the dead that cultures around the world have turned to. And I was recently on my honeymoon and I was in Japan and I was realizing that there's altars and shrines everywhere. It's not something that you see in the Western world in the same way. But there's this researcher who I love, who, if I'm sure you know her work, Mary Frances O'Connor. She wrote a book called Grieving Brain, and she has another book coming out this year too. She writes about how she's one of the first scientists to, as far as I know, publish what is actually happening to the human brain when we are grieving. And she talks a lot about how it's sort of like the spinning wheel of death when your computer is about to crash, meaning we're trying to locate the person on the map and it like does not compute that they're not physically present here anymore, that they're not at and I love the idea that I use that the Apple feature Find My Friends, and I can kind of pull it open and see where my friends and family are on the map. And when someone dies, we can't locate them, and that's sort of just distressing for our brain. So Mary Frances O'Connor talks about the role that an altar can play in actually being like, okay, they're not here in the way that they once were, but they are in the cozy corner. They are at the mother tree at 1430 Multiversity. They are sort of on my bedside table where I have and it just allows your brain to lock into a place and stop the kind of the spinning and churning. Does it solve, save, stop, fix the grief? Absolutely not. But it just gives you sort of a place to anchor your focus. And I write in the book about how it reminds me of when you're in dance class and you learn how to keep your eye on the wall as you spin around, and you need a place to focus your gaze lest you fall over. I think altars can kind of give us that place of like a place to steady our gaze in the early days and long after the early days of someone's departure.
Yeah, I find it really beautiful to have those. And it doesn't have to be one place or one thing. I feel like so many things are altars to Sammy, that some that people know about, like his gravesite, and some that nobody knows about that are just mine and his. So I think there's so many ways, beautiful ways to do that. Boy, I could talk to you for hours. We're running out of time, but I do want to ask you about this because you did the only place which I thought was interesting. I mean, you give so many beautiful pieces of research, and so much of what you're sharing and of other people's stories and yours is such actionable advice. You do speak to grief dreams, but in the spirit of this conversation, one of the things that I have found in my personal grief work and in my work in supporting so many others is that this idea of a continued relationship with our loved one is, as we've said, and as you speak to in the book so beautifully, there's so many ways to do that in the practical 3D world. It's such a huge part, I feel, of healing, of realizing that relationship doesn't end when the person is no longer in physical form. It doesn't have to. And there's lots of ways to stay connected to them in the way we're describing. But I also, at least for me, and tell me if I'm putting you on the spot, but you told me there's no question off limits.
Let's hear it.
I am very open and vocal about my belief and understanding that quantum physics is not even a belief. It's a law of quantum physics, that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. And we are pure energy. We seem solid. We seem separate from each other. But if we were to look at ourselves through an atomic microscope, on an atomic level, we are pure vibrating energy. And so that energy can't be created or destroyed. It can only change form. So when our bodies die, the energy of our bodies remains. It can't be destroyed. And so one of the ways that I have has really helped me in continuing my relationship with Sammy is to connect with him, the energy of him, which is all around me. Sometimes it's on my right side. Sometimes he comes to me in lucid dreams. And that's why I'm bringing up you do speak to grief dreams. Sometimes in meditation, sometimes after breath work, sometimes through my friends who are really gifted and legitimate mediums. But I'm wondering since you only spoke to it in the context of grief dreams and kind of resolution of conflicts or issues you had, that was kind of how you approached it in the book, which was beautiful and important. I'm just wondering what you think or what your experience has been in that realm.
In the more metaphysical?
Yeah, in the more metaphysical ways of keeping that relationship alive.
I'm like 11 out of 10 all in. And Yeah, it was interesting when I was talking to publishers about this book. One of the editors I was speaking to was like, "So, is this a spiritual book?" And I was like, "It's not. It is about matters of the spirit, but
Yeah.
it's not like I wouldn't categorize this under spiritual literature."
Yes.
In my world, my being a caretaker for my dad as he was dying, and then in the sort of immediate after of his passing was a huge spiritual opening and has sort of pushed me into a process of inquiry that I've gone through around like, well, what do I think? And it's a question that many of us who've experienced death are left asking. It brings up the biggest questions. And I made the decision in this book to not fully let my like metaphysical freak flag fly,
Yeah, I noticed that.
mostly because I think that all of the care practices in the book are starting points to
Yeah.
explore whatever it is you believe. And it's felt really important to me to encourage people to go on that pursuit themselves as opposed to suggest what my metaphysical view of the universe is. So yes, it was an interesting, and there's chapters about psychedelics and there's chapters
Yes.
about dreams as you're calling out, and but it felt important. I think sometimes the leading with the spiritual orientation or like a what would get I think oversimplified into like a new age orientation can shut people down. And I grew up in California, but my family is all New Yorkers.
Yeah.
I kind of as I was writing it, I was thinking very much about like, would my uncles roll their eyes at this and be like, "You're full of shit"? And that was like one of the litmus tests.
Yeah,
It's
that
like,
was my first book, my first spiritual book I wrote with that in mind, Quantum Love. So I know what you're speaking to. I think your next book is going to be more in that realm. And I just went through this with my publisher because I have a book that's not coming out until the middle of 2026. I'm writing it right now called Crying Out Loud. And as I was talking with the editor and the publisher, first of all, they wanted the spiritual section to go much later in the book. And then they start, you have all this research for all these other pieces. Do you have research for what you're saying in this realm? Like you have to be able to back this up. And I was like, yeah, I can use all my quantum physics research. It's all there. But it's just interesting how they were kind of speaking to the same thing that you're speaking to, that like, be careful about letting your freak flag fly, which I think is a valid concern. And I'm not saying you should have done it in this book. I think this book is beautiful and so tangible and so action friendly and so comforting and inspiring. So I'm not saying it's missing anything, not having it. But as someone who, as much as I'm crying out loud, is waving my metaphysical freak flag out loud, like I think more of us need to speak because what I find is and you probably find this too, when you speak to people, even the curmudgeony New Yorkers, I'm from the East Coast as well, they may act that way on the surface, but then they pull you aside and like, listen, I got to tell you a story of something that happened to me. Oh, do you really think? So everybody, I feel like the world is ready for this and wants it. And it's such a huge part of healing, in particular from loss, is really understanding that you can have a long distance relationship. They're right here beyond the veil. The energy, the essence of who they are is still accessible to you. And you can stay in communion with them. You can stay in conversation with them. You can stay in connection with them. You can feel them. You can sense them. You can get signs from them. Like, I feel like that is, in my experience, such a huge part that adds to the healing. So that's just my vote for waving it out loud, baby, while you're doing this book tour.
listen, maybe I'll write a addendum chapter that is the like what ended up on the cutting room floor. I'm thinking about Claire Bidwell Smith, who I'm sure wrote the beautiful book After This. I recommend that to listeners who are like, yes, where is the version of this book that explores some of the more metaphysical aspects of this? I love Claire's book, and she has her as a person. She's an incredible therapist.
She is.
And my hope is that this, by giving people 24 care practices to experiment with, that they are pulled into kind of deeper inquiry and questions around the big questions that someone dying really presents, not in a hypothetical way, but in like a very concrete, like, where do we go?
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible not to. And I always say that the trauma of loss is one of the most beautiful portals there are, that if you're brave enough to go through it, you can't go through it without being completely transformed and without really questioning some big metaphysical questions that you've maybe never asked before. And it can be a gateway to a beautiful awakening if you get curious enough. But anyway, I digress from the main meat, but I just had to ask you about that. The book is called Renegade Grief.
Thank you for hanging out and taking the time. And getting to know Sammy ever so slightly from hearing you talk about him. He just sounds like an incredible human. And I'm so moved by the legislative work you all are doing. And yeah, I'm like, Laura's a renegade griever.
I am definitely a renegade griever. I'm with you, and every word resonated with me. And I'm so grateful for you and the work that you're doing in the world. And we will put all of that, the dinner party link, the links to your social media, the link to the book in the show notes.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening and crying out loud with me. If something you heard today helped or made you feel less alone, please follow, share, and review. And for more tools and a community that deeply understands you and your pain, visit the Grief Healing Collective at drlauraberman.com/grief healing. I'll see you next time on Crying Out Loud.
There's a hollow in my chest where your laughter used to be. Space at every table, an empty seat I see. The woman I was before you left didn't make it through, but love is still alive in me and still there between us two. They say just let it be alright. Just keep your pain inside. But love this deep and pain this true were never meant to hide. So I'm crying out loud. I'm not holding it in. I'm shrinking my heart for the shape I am in. If grief is the echo of love that resounds, then grief's a tsunami. Some days it's just a wave. Some days I'm barely breathing. Some days I feel so brave. But I am learning slowly what the breaking's about. The only way to freedom is feeling it out. Every tear that hits the ground is not a sign I'm weak. It's the sound of love still reaching, still learning how to speak. So I'm crying out loud, let the whole world see. Love didn't leave, it's alive. Can